For a long time, if you went to my YouTube channel under my videos tab, you would have seen a video about a movie called Penda's Fen. This was the second major video project I completed after part 1 of Fundamentally Loathsome, and I never liked it. I always thought the footage was rough, the editing was sloppy, and the presentation needed work. But because at the time I was making an effort to start up a YouTube channel and I couldn't really afford to be too picky or self-critical, I put it out anyway, despite its many flaws, and thankfully some people did enjoy it. It got about 6,000 views, so it wasn't a total waste. Although it did take me a very long time to edit because I found the editing experience so torturously tedious due to my dislike of the content. Recently, I watched the film again and I was struck by just how much I understood the film in a way that I hadn't before. Now, when I made that other video, I did understand the film pretty well already, but something about this watch through just made me feel complete in a way I'd never felt before when watching this film, and I immediately knew that I would have to remake my video about it. Back when I put it up, I was in a state of mind where I had so much anxiety and insecurity and inexperience that I was actually unable to tell the difference between me being overly perfectionist and the video just plain not being good. So in my ignorance, I decided to put up the video even though I didn't like it. But now things have changed, and I know what a good video looks like and what a bad video looks like. I just can't let that mediocre work define my relationship with this film forever, so I decided to unlist that video and remake the project from scratch, doing it in a style that fits the content a little better. First, I want to say that Penda's Fen might not be my favorite movie of all time, but it is the most intellectually stimulating movie I have ever seen. The only film that really comes close in my mind is a recent Charlie Kaufman movie called I'm Thinking of Ending Things. If any of you have other recommendations for films that just keep on giving with every rewatch, weaving a tapestry of meaning and symbolism in every moment, please let me know. Other projects of a similar caliber in my mind are the web series Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, the TV show Better Call Saul, and of course the discography of Marilyn Manson. These examples of great media, few and far between though they are, represent to me the pinnacle of achievement in merging the intellect with creativity to produce entertainment that rewards you the more closely you think about it. These are works that you can just leave to ferment in your mind while you're doing other things, and you may continue to have insights about them years and years later as you keep revisiting them. They are the gifts that keep on giving. I love this movie. I love everything about it. The characters, the dialogue, the story, the message, the directing, the acting for the most part. I think it's especially impressive given the fact that it's a TV movie from the mid-70s. Just 7 years after homosexuality was legalized, we have this brainiac movie arguing for anarchism through esoteric religious imagery where the main character's internal conflict over his homosexuality takes center stage for much of the film. It's not so much the countercultural aspect that impresses me, seeing how we had a lot of movies coming out at the time that offered satire, criticism, and deconstruction of traditional institutions, but there is just something so clever about this film for the way it decided to tackle these subjects, rather than being really in-your-face and confrontational about it like some of Alan Clarke's other movies. This movie handles much of its messaging through symbolism. The inner growth of our main character, Stephen, is handled mostly through implicit thoughts communicated indirectly in his conversations, combined with hallucinatory visions and dreams. We have, in Penda's Fen, the writing of David Rudkin, a gay anarchist playwright who loves the English countryside and the ancient Greek classics, and the directing of Alan Clarke, a gritty, urban filmmaker who tells uncompromisingly realistic stories about life in England's underprivileged communities. These two are obviously very starkly different from each other, but the pairing of them makes sense. Clarke's typical straightforward style blends very well with Rudkin's more cryptic symbolism. The film treats all of its spiritual, scholarly, and symbolic elements in a very matter-of-fact style, which keeps it from feeling too indulgent. And since Clarke's films are packed with social commentary about crime and punishment and the dysfunctional British family, A story with anti-establishment themes like this one is definitely within his range, but it also challenged him with all of its intellectual content. He had to make what was a very eggheady script into a down-to-earth film, and he pulled it off perfectly. I discovered this movie when I was 17, which is the same age as Steven. It was actually, believe it or not, Carl Pilkington who set in motion the events that led me to discovering this movie, because one of his favorite movies is Kess, a film in that same kind of British realist style as Alan Clarke's movies. I was quite impressed by that film, if for nothing else as a time capsule showing the downright medieval way people in Yorkshire used to talk.
Don't they like company? They said their mother does. Has got more uncles in this city than any other kid.
Shut him off.
Come and met me.
How much of that to our Judy'd murder thee?
You're just now.
What, he's got a estate, that's all?
In fact, when I first saw this clip, I wasn't even sure they were speaking English. And from there, I started to get interested in British movies from the 60s and 70s, leading me to watch If, with Malcolm McDowell, The Ruling Class with Peter O'Toole, and eventually The Wicker Man, which might actually be my favorite movie of all time. I looked for other British movies to watch on BFI's list of top 100 British films, and I found this one all the way at number 5. The title and image intrigued me. I had heard of King Penda before, and I knew he was an Anglo-Saxon king of Mercia, but that was about it. But this image of Penda's bloody hand reaching out to Stephen like the hand of Christ was just so interesting. When I watched the movie, it proved to be just as interesting as I could have hoped. Actually, watching this movie was for decades a very difficult thing to accomplish, since it was one of those movies that BBC used to make just to have on standby. Some of those films were never aired on television and are now lost because there was no preservation of TV programming back then. Many of David Rudkin's TV plays are now extinct. They no longer exist. Which is a shame, because I've read some synopses of some of them, and they seem very interesting. Go to his website if you want to know more about those. Penda Sven aired once in the 70s, to critical acclaim, and then it vanished. It became a rumor, a mysterious event that some people bore witness to, and could be gleaned only from reading old TV guides and newspaper reviews. It was kind of like a creepypasta lost media sort of thing. In the 90s, it was finally given a new release on Channel 4, where it was aired once and never again. But fortunately, enough people had tape recorders by then that several people were able to bootleg it on VHS tapes. And from those tapes, it got a tiny bit of extra life. Still, it is impressive that this film managed to stay in the consciousness and memory of British film aficionados for so many years, even though they didn't have much access to it. It is a testament to the film's quality. Penda Sven never really got a renaissance in popularity, but several uploads of the film have made it to YouTube over the years, getting over 100,000 views apiece. It is clear that there is a small but interested fan base for this movie, and with the recent DVD release that came out pretty much the year I discovered this movie, we all breathed a sigh of relief that finally we could just watch Penda Sven like any other movie, and we didn't have to hunt it down like Raiders of the Lost Ark. The movie starts with David Rudkin giving us a yarn about some stupid fucking mountain in Worcestershire.
Behind me there is Bredon Hill, Houseman country. And westward, nearer than they seem, the Malvern Hills.
Yada. Great. I will point out, though, that Rudkin is wearing yellow in this clip, which is probably a coincidence, but might not be. You see, Stephen is frequently shown wearing yellow in this film, as well as another character named William Arne. To my memory, these are the only two characters who wear yellow outside of this dream sequence. And it also happens that these two characters function as self-inserts for Rudkin himself. Stephen is gay, which matches Rudkin's sexuality, and William Arne is an environmental anarchist who writes television plays that all feature gay characters, which is exactly what David Rudkin is.
He's a terrible crank, Father.
He is a shocker.
He's not a nice man from his television plays. Well, can't you, Mother? There's always somebody in them unnatural. I think he's unnatural himself. That's why he and his wife haven't been blessed with children.
If we interpret these two characters as self-inserts, then it's kind of like Rudkin is portraying his own self-loathing here, or as the kids say, his internalized homophobia. It's worth noting that William Arne is not a confirmed bachelor. He has a wife, although as Stephen pointed out, they haven't been blessed with any children. But lest you think this alludes to something, let me assure you that it's not for want of trying. But still, Arne never really seems to show any affection for his wife, and he's even kind of mean to her in this scene.
Put the cat down, dear. She isn't a child.
It's like his wife holding the cat in a motherly way is just triggering his frustration over not being able to have children, and he's mad at her for being infertile. The wife seems pretty upset about it too.
I only hope you and your future wife will make a better chemical compound than us two. Oh, we got one started. It fell out. My womb rejects. Chemical.
But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Where were we? Oh yeah, the beginning of the movie. Well, technically before the movie. Yeah, this little prologue here is not included on the DVD. I think it was made in the 90s for the Channel 4 re-airing because Rudkin looks kind of old here, and that would explain why BBC doesn't have the rights to it. But I suppose the point of this prologue is that David Rudkin wants to set up how the geography of England gives us clues to understanding England's ancient past, that there is layer upon layer upon layer of inheritance in the English countryside, and that the English countryside contains the memory of cultures long since alienated from its soil, pagan cultures of the ancient Celts, and even before them, the Neolithic Britons who built Stonehenge and Avebury. This is, of course, to remind us that when the Britons of the 20th century spoke of God and country, the country they were talking about existed long before the concept of the God that they associate with this country, and the very names they still use to this day to refer to the landmarks like Bredon Hill and the Malvern Hills have ancient Brythonic roots that stretch back to before the introduction of Christianity into England. Thus, the vaunted tradition of English Toryism is itself an invasive corruption of England's true traditional past, a memory that has been mostly forgotten to time, but in the light of this film, still lives on in the spirit of England, an ineffable, supernatural essence of England's past that still lingers in sacred locations like the titular fen of King Penda, the last pagan king of England. According to Rudkin, the idea for this movie came to him when he was driving through Worcestershire and came across a village called Penvin. Penvin, he discovered, was an Old English name, Pendaven, or Penda's Fen. Penda was king of Mercia, which was the middle bit of Old England back before Alfred the Great, when England was a land of several smaller kingdoms. Worcestershire was included in a package deal he got for beating the West Saxons at the Battle of Cirencester in 628. And so as he gained sovereignty over this old strip of grassy peat, it became his fen, Penda's Fen. And the significance of Penvin was not just down to its association with King Penda as the last pagan king of England, and therefore a symbol of England's pre-Christian past. It was also down to the fact that it is a fen in the first place. A fen is a wetland made out of peat, and peat is an accumulation of partially decayed vegetation that is compressed into a kind of incredibly rich dirt which can be used for lots of different purposes, including the preservation of so-called bog bodies, which are wet human mummies preserved for thousands of years by the weird pH levels contained within the peat. These bog bodies offer us an up-close and personal glimpse of the kind of people who lived in England prior to the introduction of Christianity, including this poor fuck who was garroted, stabbed, and beaten the fuck out of before being thrown into a bog and accidentally mummified by the weird acidic water. I suppose the best case scenario is that they killed him because he was some sort of rapist. I like to imagine he was a sheep fucker that just got tired of him fucking their sheep, so they got together and iced him. But anyway, setting aside the bog bodies, the mere fact that peat fens are created out of the accumulation of ancient preserved biotic material is itself an important symbol. The fen of King Penda not only carries the name of one of the last guardians of England's past, it also preserves within its very chemical composition the memory of many lives long gone, the millions of grass blades that grew, died, and partially decayed on top of each other over the course of thousands of years, the greenery that makes up England's nostalgic self-image can be found in partially decayed form in these peat fens dating back millennia ago. Because of this, the fen is given a sacred quality of importance in this film, and it is imbued with a sense of spirit, as if it were a conscious entity with a life of its own. The English countryside that's so vaunted by poets and nostalgics, both Tory and human, thus has a life, a spirit, and a name. And in this film, it has the ability to fight back. Against what, exactly? Well, against all of it. Against the ever-encroaching machine of industrial productivity that threatens to destroy its pristine ancient greenery, against the Toryistic butt-fuckery of the school system and rugby football, the stiff upper lip and the straight wrist, against the doctrine fixers who poison spirituality by turning it into a conformist guilt trip, against all that is proper and stifling to the human spirit, against all forces which seek to put us in boxes and strip us away from our connection with our beloved nature, both internal and external. The fen of David Rudkin's anarchist imagination is the ancient guardian of England's sacred flame of ungovernableness, and within its body walk the mighty ghosts of England's past, the great composer Edward Elgar, and of course, Penda himself, who reveals himself to Stephen at the end of the movie. When the film properly begins, we get this shot of the fen, accompanied by the music of The Dream of Gerontius by Edward Elgar.
Oh, my country, I say over and over, I am one of your sons, it is true. I am. I am. Yet how shall I show my love?
This brief voiceover monologue from Stephen serves as an epigraph to the whole movie. It's the central theme of the movie, just stated outright at the beginning of the film. Here, we have a kid who is imbued with a sense of deep patriotic spirituality, a deep love for his country. As a child, loves his mother and father. And yet, it is unclear to him just how he should express this feeling. He repeats to himself over and over that he is one of England's sons, as if he doesn't believe it and must continuously repeat it in the vain attempt to convince himself of something he knows in his heart is not true. And yet, he desperately needs it to be true in order for his love to feel validated. In this epigraph, we can analyze the basis for Stephen's anxiety, his essentialist framework. To Stephen, everything is black and white.
Why is Manichaeism a heresy, Dad? The world is a battleground between good and evil. Why is it an error to believe so?
The world is a battleground between good and evil, and in order for Stephen to feel secure in himself, he must believe that he is inherently good, and that means supporting every good institution and opposing all attempts to deconstruct those institutions. It means living his life according to the most proper standards of an English norm, and looking down on those people who don't take this obligation as seriously as he does.
Some of us are learning to defend our country.
I should get your anklets straight then. England's last hope.
To Stephen, good and evil are essential qualities of things. Angels are inherently good, and demons are inherently evil. Marriage between a man and a woman is inherently good, and homosexuality is inherently evil and unnatural.
Unnatural.
That which is good is that which conforms to a standard of naturalness, as if nature is somehow inherently good, because nature is God's creation, and God is inherently good, so nature has to be good too, right? For that reason, anything that goes against God must also be against nature, and therefore unnatural. A corruption of the way things are supposed to be, assuming that Satan doesn't interfere with the natural functioning of God's plan. This is obviously a very stupid way to view life, but it is unfortunately also a very common way to view life. It's the essence of what Marilyn Manson calls the fascism of Christianity. So to Stephen, if he is a son of England, then he must essentially be a son of England, which means he must be born of English parents and live his life according to the expectations of a vaunted English norm. And yet, he knows deep down that he isn't that. As much as he tries to succeed in his military apprenticeship, he knows that he is, at heart, a pansy-ass pussy. He's an intellectual who doesn't actually want to fight for his country, but would rather spend his time listening to classical music and writing essays in his diary.
Just because a guy is sensitive and he's an intellectual and he wears glasses, you make him out a queer.
I never said a guy who wears glasses is a queer. A guy who wears glasses is a four eyes. A guy who is a fag is a queer.
A manly English Christian is supposed to enjoy rugby, but Stephen hates rugby, and he's terrible at it.
I only wish, Franklin, you would now and then transfer your Manichaean impulse to the rugby field.
A true son of England would be respected by his peers, but nobody respects Stephen except for his own father, because he's a stuck-up little prick who takes out his insecurities on other people by acting like he's better than other people because he's such a good little Tory twink. Even if they were willing to forgive his absolutely pathetic unmanliness, since he has too much pride to take a joke at his expense or to have any kind of self-awareness, nobody likes him. And of course, the true son of England would fuck his wife in the vagina to make a baby. And Stephen has never once thought of a vagina as anything other than an abstract notion. Instead, his gaze is turned to Joel the Milk Lad, a sexy hot man a few years older than him who thinks he's a total joke. And yet Stephen has a pathetic, unrequited crush on him, a crush that he still, at the age of 17, is pathetically unaware of, to the point where even his parents mock him for it behind his back.
Milk Lad. Hardly original.
Even his parents know that Stephen is a fruity little flaming poofty-woofty, to the point where the fact that Stephen hasn't realized it yet is starting to get old to them. And of course, later on in the film, Stephen learns that his parents aren't even his parents, and that he's actually an adopted child of non-English descent. In no way does Stephen actually fit into this essentialist framework that he's assigned to himself, and yet he clings to it and feels guilty about not living up to this standard. So when Stephen says, "Yet how shall I show my love?" this is an interesting open-ended question that serves as the central theme of the piece. The question is never whether Stephen should show his love, or love England at all. At no point in the story is Stephen's love for England called into question or undermined. Instead, this film takes it as unquestioned gospel truth that to love England is a strong point of virtue for Stephen. The question is how he should show his love. And in the beginning of the story, he believes the answer is to be an exclusionary, essentialist, God-fearing Christian nationalist. He believes this is the only way to do it, and yet he finds himself incapable of doing it, which causes him great anxiety. But by the end of the film, this imagination is shattered and replaced by a much more anarchist way of thinking, which puts him in touch with his true nature and the true nature of England's past and present. So in this story, Stephen learns the all-important lesson that there is harmony in dissonance, and there's a mixture of light and dark, good and evil in everything. And that mixture is where his patriotic love must reside if he wants to truly express it to its greatest and freest extent. After the epigraph, the dream of Gerontius continues to play over this rural scene until we get one of my favorite parts of the movie, the title card. Wow, that is stunning. It was such a brilliant idea to use some sort of audio engineering technique to artificially extend this unearthly high note as the opera singer utters the word Alleluia, which is Hebrew for praise God. It creates such a weird, haunting, otherworldly tone that immediately brings us out of the grounded feeling of the English countryside and into something far more spiritual, and thus somewhat terrifying. There's one subtle effect that I really like where before the title comes on screen, we can hear some sort of lower pitch enter the fray that almost sounds like a howling wolf. And of course, we have to acknowledge the visuals. Overlaid on the image of Pinvin, we get a barbed wire fence with a hand reaching up to it, attempting to climb over it. The hand is marked with these very strange looking burn marks that don't look like any kind of burn I've ever seen. There's a Y pattern on both sides of the hand that almost looks as if somebody poured rivers of lava down this person's arm in a very intentional way. I will wait until later in the video, in fact, the very end of the video, to explain the significance of all this. But as an opener, it's a brilliantly intriguing way to introduce the film. With no context on what this movie is going to be, I instantly wanted to watch the rest of it. Eventually, the opera continues as normal, and we get a shot of the parish church while this very ominous section of the piece plays that makes it sound like we're about to see some spooky shit. It's revealed that the dream of Gerontius is actually being played on an LP in Stephen's room as he stormily contemplates his own final judgment, before his mother boneheadedly interrupts him right before it gets to the most climactic moment in the piece. I love this moment. It's not only relatable as a teenage experience, but when you understand what was going on in the dream of Gerontius at that moment, and why that was the absolute worst moment his mother could have come in and interrupted him, you do kind of get his frustration. He was having a moment deep in thought where he was letting the music fill his ears to the brim with sound so that nothing other than the dream of Gerontius was on his mind. And just as it reaches its climax, his mom comes in to tell him it's too loud. Too loud? Bitch, I'm contemplating my final judgment. You better fucking believe it's gonna be loud. You see, to his mother, it just looks like Stephen is listening to some music. But to Stephen, it means so much more than that. And that's what we find out in the next few minutes as Stephen reads an essay he wrote in his diary about the piece. And we get to see why this piece means so much to him.
We come to the crisis. Gerontius asks, shall he see God? The angel cries with joy. This soul is strong enough to look on God, and stand the terror and the shock. And so they come before the throne of God. A terrible silence. And then breaks out a brief, fearful dissonance. The moment of the glance of God. Surely the most shattering moment in all of music.
Yeah, so the ominous music we got over the shot of the parish church in the LP was actually the moment where Gerontius was being led by the angel to the approach of God. And the exact moment when Gerontius gets a terrifying and earth-shattering glimpse of God himself is the moment where Stephen's mother decided to pull the needle off the record. Stephen wasn't just listening to this music, he was putting himself in the role of Gerontius. He was going to meet his maker. He was putting himself face to face with the horrifying dissonance of truth, that which confounded him so deeply because his essentialist framework prevented him from truly understanding and appreciating what that dissonance means. To Stephen, God is a mysterious and terrifying force of nature that he must reckon with. And just as he is about to get that bone-chilling glimpse at his own creator, his stupid fucking mother comes in and ruins it all. And then she has the audacity to denigrate him and tell him that he's being silly.
Don't be silly, Stephen.
Silly? Bitch, this is my immortal soul we're talking about. You think that's silly? And of course it is silly. On the outside, if you're not in Stephen's head, it looks quite petty and bratty how he behaves in this moment. If your thoughts are not daily impacted by the fear of hell and the insecurity that you're not living up to the standard that God has set for you, and on top of that, if you're unfamiliar with the significance of the piece Stephen is listening to, and you just refer to it as good music, how can you possibly understand what he's going through in this moment? This is a fantastic scene because it shows so much about Stephen's psychology. He is a sensitive soul who is very hard on himself, and he bottles up his feelings so much that it gives the impression that he's some sort of whiny, snobby bitch. But underneath this exterior, we can see what he's really going through, and we can understand why he behaves this way, and also why everyone else in his life seems to not understand him, except for his dad.
To hear in your head such sounds. To be a man. Have heaven and hell between your ears and write them down in notes. And walk those hills and hear the angel and the demon. The judgment on those hills. And hear the dissonance that is the piercing glance of God.
It's worth noting that we don't actually get to hear the glimpse of God until the end of this movie, and we're kind of blue-balled on it until that point. But what we do know is that whatever this moment is, it's a moment of musical dissonance, where instead of beautiful harmony, we are treated to a scary cacophony of noises that don't line up with each other. Stephen seems to interpret this dissonance as terrifying because it represents the angel and the demon, or the uncertainty of divine judgment. God might look at Gerontius and decide that he's a good soul and will go to heaven. Or he might look at Gerontius and decide to send him to hell. But in any case, we have an essentialist reading of the situation. And one of the most brilliant aspects of this movie is how, at the end of the film, when we finally do get to hear the glimpse of God as Stephen plays it on the organ, we finally understand what this dissonance truly means. We understand that in God, there is a unity of opposites. There is a harmony in dissonance. There is a beauty in ugliness. There is a truth in impurity. And we will get to understand that better as we go through the film. Next, we see Stephen's pathetic attempt to get Joel's attention.
I wish Joel had liked me. He can be so cutting.
Then we see Stephen playing the organ at the school chapel, and we get treated to David Rudkin's obsession with Greek and Latin.
Genothi seauton. That means discover thyself.
Uncover thy ass, more like.
Honeybone. That's dirty.
That's pretty funny. Then we get a scene of Stephen at the debate club seconding the premise that this house believes that the media are a source of evil to society.
The so-called TV documentary, Who Was Jesus? We know in our hearts it is atheistic and subversive trash. From this at least, the homes of England have been saved by a timely injunction, for which we have not the abstraction of freedom itself to thank, but those who exercise eternal vigilance on its behalf. Look at this man and woman. See if you do not see them as I see them. A mother and a father above all parents. A mother and a father of England, who in this modern wilderness of amorality stand up alone to uphold our erring national family on its Christian path.
There's so much to dissect in this scene. Let's start at the end. Stephen, in referring to these two as a mother and a father of England, and referring to England as our erring national family, is making the point that he views his country as a nation of children who must be morally guided by their superiors. He thus has a very authoritarian view of society, and yet it is a softened English form of authoritarianism which values the English liberal tradition.
Our country, England, is the freest in the world. We have liberty of movement, liberty of choice, free speech, a free press. We do not have political censorship. Our police are not armed. We do not have a secret police.
Actually, Stephen's speech here reminds me greatly of a YouTuber I used to watch named Sargon of Akkad, who identifies as an English liberal. And to him, that means something rather different than what most people mean when they identify as liberal. To Sargon, an English liberal is somebody who values the English liberal tradition, somebody who understands that society has rules and must have rules in order to function properly, and even that society needs religion in order to function properly, but nonetheless values a certain level of political freedom, democracy, free speech, and openness.
It's only as I have matured out of my 20s and 30s and now into my 40s that I realize how short-sighted the new atheists seems to have been, because, I mean, it's very easy to break apart the dogmatism that comes from a 2,000-year-old book. Obviously, it's not going to be consistent or scientific or rational. Obviously, it vastly predates that era. But that's kind of missing the point of it, isn't it? Because really the point, I think, is to provide sort of moral direction. And I think that without this, when you take this away, you kind of leave people in a bit of a fog, not knowing what they should be doing with their lives. And we're kind of left in this very sort of hedonistic utilitarian period where almost anything seems to go now. There's no particular boundaries anymore other than direct physical harm. And so if you're not directly harming someone, or it's not obvious that someone's in pain, then pretty much anything goes, doesn't it?
Thus, we get Stephen's line, "For which we have not the abstraction of freedom itself to thank, but those who exercise eternal vigilance on its behalf." In other words, freedom is important, but it cannot exist if we let society fall apart by failing to recognize the importance of religion in life, or failing to recognize the importance of rules in society. Therefore, we need people like these two who are willing to stand up against the libertarian anything goes mentality and say no to immorality. To say that there are certain things and certain ideas that the English public should just not be exposed to, because they are corrupting influences. And with enough of these corrupting influences, the liberal society of freedom that England currently enjoys will not be able to exist, because people will lose their sense of understanding what matters about this liberal society, the rules that keep this society from falling apart into pure anarchy and hedonism. It's important to understand that England didn't just happen to be the birthplace of liberalism by pure coincidence. England has always had a very peculiar sense of its own rights, stretching back to the Dark Ages. The Magna Carta could be seen as one of the defining documents in English history, because it, for the first time, put some square limitations on the power of the king. And this, of course, was justified by the fact that in Old English times, before the Norman conquest, kings weren't seen as absolute monarchs, and they had to be elected by the Witan, or Council of Lords. When Queen Matilda, who was used to the way things functioned in Germany, where she was the empress, tried to just assert herself as some sort of absolute monarch, the Londoners took great offense to that, because that's just not how things were done in England. The King of England was not, and never has been, above the law of the land. Later on, in the 17th century, the barons of Parliament got so fed up with the king putting taxes on them that they launched a civil war, and when the king was determined a traitor to his country, they had him executed. The monarchy was later brought back under Charles II, but his brother James II was exiled to France for being a Catholic, and this episode of 1689, dubbed the Glorious Revolution, signaled the birth of Great Britain as a true parliamentary government, because William III, who was king of both England and the Netherlands, presided over the Bill of Rights, which stated, in so many terms, that the king was no longer the body with the most power in the land, and that even though he was still theoretically the highest authority in the land, Parliament would now be the body truly in control of the country, not the king. I like this passage from The Crowd by sociologist Gustave Le Bon, because it illustrates how England's liberal reputation went beyond its own waters and even reached people on the continent, like Le Bon, who was an Anglophile and self-hating Frenchman who believed that England was a far superior country for its measured and polite political culture. The difference between a Latin and an Anglo-Saxon crowd is striking. The most recent facts in French history throw a vivid light on this point. The mere publication 25 years ago of a telegram relating an insult supposed to have been offered an ambassador was sufficient to determine an explosion of fury, whence followed immediately a terrible war. Some years later, the telegraphic announcement of an insignificant reverse at Lançon provided a fresh explosion which brought about the instantaneous overthrow of the government. At the same moment, a much more serious reverse undergone by the English expedition to Khartoum produced only a slight emotion in England, and no ministry was overturned. Crowds are everywhere distinguished by feminine characteristics, but Latin crowds are the most feminine of all. Whoever trusts in them may rapidly attain a lofty destiny, but to do so is to be perpetually skirting the brink of a Tarpeian rock, with the certainty of one day being precipitated from it. Dictatorialness and intolerance are common to all categories of crowds, but they are met with in a varying degree of intensity. Here, once more, reappears that fundamental notion of race, which dominates all the feelings and the thoughts of men. It is more especially in Latin crowds that authoritativeness and intolerance are found developed in the highest measure. In fact, their development is such in crowds of Latin origin that they have entirely destroyed that sentiment of the independence of the individual, so powerful in the Anglo-Saxon. Latin crowds are only concerned with the collective independence of the sect to which they belong, and the characteristic feature of their conception of independence is the need they experience of bringing those who are in disagreement with themselves into immediate and violent subjection to their beliefs.
The French cannot be trusted.
So when Stephen says, "Our country, England, is the freest in the world," essentially he is refusing to take this liberty for granted. He is an English exceptionalist, and proud to be living in a country where the police are not armed, and the people have liberty of movement and a free press. But of course, this comes into conflict with his authoritarian tendencies. While he might value the fact that the government doesn't step in and tell the Englishman what he is allowed to watch on TV, he is also glad that private citizens are able to successfully make a stand against allowing such trash to air. And the trash in question is a documentary called Who Was Jesus?, which questions the narrative found in the Gospel. And that alone is too much for Stephen Franklin. Then we get a small moment with Stephen's parents lying in bed discussing whether they should tell him about the fact that he's adopted. Of course, the film doesn't reveal what this secret is until later on, leaving it a nice little mystery for the viewers. Then we get the parish hall meeting, which I guess is a thing that they do in small towns in England. Usually it happens at a church and the vicar presides over the discussion. In this case, it's Stephen's dad, who happens to be the parson at their parish church. At the table with him, we have this gentleman on the left, who is dressed in a gray suit, and this man on the right, who we of course already know is William Arne, an anarchist conspiracy theorist playwright who appears to live off the grid, growing his own vegetables like Tom and Barbara from The Good Life. When we enter the scene, he's debating against this Tory windbag about the current strike that's happening, and talking about how the government is a wasteful institution. Stephen's pretty miffed about all this, but when Arne brings up Edward Elgar, we get this great little moment where Stephen's scowl softens a bit. Like he can't totally hate Arne now that he knows he appreciates the work of England's greatest composer.
Somewhere there the land is hollow. Somewhere beneath is being constructed something we are not supposed to know. A top secret. We locals are not supposed to know it's even there. What is it then? An air raid shelter to shift the population of Birmingham to in all of 4 minutes. What is it hidden beneath this shell of lovely earth? Some hideous angel of technocratic death.
Yeah, this loony Alex Jones level conspiracy theory about what's being constructed under the Fen doesn't really come up again very much in this story, but it does have some importance for understanding what happens next. This car full of drunk idiots stops in the middle of the Fen for who knows what reason as one of them runs out to go, I don't know, fuck a sheep or something, but when he gets back, he looks like this.
The man in the fire.
The man in the fire, of course, is revealed at the end of the movie to be Penda, as he appears to Stephen engulfed in flames. So, what happened here? Did this guy just run out in the Fen, run into Penda, and then get burned like crazy? We can also see sitting next to him an army officer and a constable, so this is clearly a matter of special interest to the military, which of course lines up with what Arne was saying about the military building something out in the Fen. A couple of scenes later, Stephen's father is showing Arne a newspaper headline about the incident, which claims it was a weather balloon accident. Yeah, Arne isn't buying it.
Everywhere you'll find these sick laboratories built on or beneath such haunted sites, as though thereby to bottle the primal genie of the earth and to pervert him.
Interesting he says this, because Arne believes that this weather balloon mishap was actually caused by whatever the military was building under the Fen, some hideous angel of technocratic death. But obviously there is a supernatural element here, since we know that the sheep fucker guy, he saw Penda in the Fen, so I actually think it was Penda who did it. I mean, obviously Penda was there. I do think that the military was building something under the Fen, hence why the army officer was there at the hospital. But what actually burned the guy was the spirit of the Fen rising up in retaliation against whatever that the military was doing, destroying the natural environment to make way for some hellish industrial nonsense. Burning some drunk retard who stumbled out in the Fen to fuck a sheep was probably Penda's way of sending a message to the military, telling them to stop working there or more people will get burned. And of course, the police then block off the road. I'm using Penda interchangeably with the spirit of the Fen because I think that the spirit of Penda resides in the Fen as the Fen's protector and, by extension, one of the guardians of England's sacred flame. Edward Elgar is another one, who we will see later in the movie. I think the Fen has its own spirit, but it is also in communion with these guardians who live there, and they collectively present Stephen with the visions that he experiences throughout the movie, in dreams and in waking life. It's not really supposed to have any clear world building, though. The visionary world of this film is not meant to be more mythological than logical. It's essentially a dream, and according to Stephen's father,
your dream tells you a truth about yourself. Truth you hide from while you're awake. Truth you need to know about yourself. for your well-being.
Of course, this is Reverend Franklin's not-so-subtle way of telling Stephen to pay attention to his horny dreams about Joel the Milk-Lad so that he can finally put it together that he's a homosexual and end this ridiculous front of his. But of course, it also tells something about the way this movie is supposed to be interpreted. As a dream, with the logic of a dream rather than the logic of a real-world story, and yet it is a dream that reveals a certain truth about our world. So we must pay attention to the symbolism therein to understand what truth this film is attempting to convey. And of course, that night, Stephen has a dream, and it's gay as fuck. There's no getting around it this time. We are looking at lots of boy legs and boy butts crowding together, covered in mud, obviously symbolizing a rugby match, but in the most homoerotic way possible, barring nudity. We also get these rather Freudian shots of Stephen getting pelted by what looks like animal dung. I could make a fudge packing joke here, but I think what we're really supposed to get from this sequence is some insight into why Stephen is so bad at rugby. It's not just that he's a wimp who sucks at sports. It's also because being around all these athletic hot guys running around in these skimpy shorts and, of course, taking off their clothes in the gymnasium changing rooms really heightens his feeling of unconscious anxiety over his sexuality and makes him feel different from all the other boys, self-conscious about engaging in such casual intimacy as if he's not entirely a man in the first place.
What sort of person are you going to be? I do not say what sort of man. I begin to wonder, Franklin, whether you want to be a man at all.
I love this little double entendre. He was totally on the money, but more so than he even realized. And if all that wasn't clear enough, we get this moment of, oh, who do we have here? That, my friends, is a lad known as Corporal Honeybone. And can you get a more homoerotic name than that? You might as well call him Corporal Sugar Dick, because that's what he represents to Stephen's subconscious. Stephen, apparently, is hopelessly attracted to men who don't respect him. And if you thought Joel the Milk-Lad was bad, wait till you hear the things that Honeybone says about him.
Franklin doesn't do anything for the house, sir. But he's a passenger. He ought to be boiled in oil. They're skinned first, then boiled alive.
Jesus Christ, kid, what the fuck? I like how the teacher doesn't even interject here. He's just like, yes, boiled in oil. That sounds about right. Good one, Honeybone. Here, let me give you your pornographic magazine back. You deserve it. Full marks. So we see Stephen giving everything short of a full rectal examination to Mr. Honeybone here. It's important to note that this is the same school gymnasium changing room where we see the words Gnophi auton.
That means discover thyself.
Uncover thy ass, more like.
Honeybone. That's dirty.
Yeah, well, that's not the dirtiest thing that's going to happen between you and Honeybone in this changing room, I can tell you that, Stephen. And, of course, when he gets to where Honeybone's Honeybone would be, instead of being greeted with the ecstasy of touching another man's penis for the first time, he's treated with his first taste of the eternal flames that will surely torment his immortal soul once he reaches the afterlife, which is never a pleasant thought. In fact, this experience is so unpleasant that it wakes him up, and he sees this. The Night Hag, or Old Hag, is the name given to a supernatural creature commonly associated with the phenomenon of sleep paralysis. It is a phenomenon which a person feels during a presence of a supernatural, malevolent being, which immobilizes the person as if sitting on their chest or at the foot of their bed. The word nightmare, or nightmare, was used to describe this phenomenon before the word received its modern, more general meaning. Various cultures have various names for this phenomenon and its supernatural character. Blink and you'll miss it. There's a shot of the demon's face with Joel the Milk-Lad superimposed onto it. It's clear that this demon is here to confront Stephen with his homosexuality in no uncertain terms. This is, of course, the most iconic moment in the movie, and the moment that's used on the cover of the DVD and the thumbnail of this video. It's just a cool shot. It's important to note that the demon is not the only supernatural creature that Stephen sees in this dream. Before we get to all the gay shit, the dream starts with a shot of these hills outside of his window, illuminated by the dawn. We get a more realistic shot of these hills earlier in the movie when Stephen is narrating his Elgar essay.
To be a man, have heaven and hell between your ears, and write them down in notes. And walk those hills, and hear the angel and the demon, the judgment on those hills, and hear the dissonance that is the piercing glance of God.
So, with these two hills appearing in his dream, we can expect to see heaven and hell, the angel and the demon, the judgment, and the dissonance that is the piercing glance of God. We see an angel appear over these two hills, and then we get the same angel rising over the parish church.
It's not for nothing that always round churches ghosts and demons give the greatest trouble, they do say.
Ah, because the church gives often as powerfully the Manichaean challenge.
Some would say that the spire of a church acts as an aerial, attracting around it the old elemental forces of light and darkness in combat. Some would say.
I am not sure which side the church has always been on.
At this point, I suppose I should talk about Manichaeism, which in this movie they call Manichaeanism. It appears as a theme a few times in this film, and it's introduced in this scene where Stephen tells the teacher about a dream he had where he saw a demon on top of the church spire, and he used his willpower to turn it into an angel. And then he used his willpower again to turn it back into a demon.
A Manichaean dream, Franklin.
The teacher writes the word Manichaeanism on the blackboard to look smart, and then proceeds to say nothing interesting about the subject and instead makes a joke about how Stephen sucks at rugby. Did I mention how much I fucking hate this teacher? I hate this teacher. Moving on. Now, Stephen describes Manichaeism as a heretical belief in the early church that the world is a battleground between the forces of good and evil. As it happens, there's way more to Manichaeism than that. It's actually an interesting subject that I devoted a bit of time talking about in my previous video about Penda's Fen, but I simply cannot be bothered to go through all that shit again because ultimately none of it is relevant for understanding this movie. This movie doesn't really portray Manichaeism accurately, it's more just there to act as a motif illustrating an important theme. And we get a bit of clarification on what this theme is later on, after Stephen sees his dad talking to William Arne, which probably signaled to Stephen that Arne isn't such a bad guy, because after all, if his dad respects him, he's probably not half bad.
Why is Manichaeanism a heresy, Dad? The world is a battleground between good and evil. Why is it an error to believe so?
I like how this conversation starts with Stephen spelling out his simplistic essentialist framework, only for his dad to call it into question.
You're a believer. We're believers. You believe in God.
I believe in truth.
And of course, as Stephen finds out through the course of the movie, the truth lies in the dissonance that is the piercing glance of God, not in light and dark as separate and essentially opposite forces. But carry on, Dad.
Manichaeans didn't believe exactly that. They believed that light was a vulnerable spark in man under constant attack from forces of darkness. They hoped for some great son of light himself to come, to vanquish darkness and set light free.
The Son of Light has come. His name is Jesus.
Not to the Manichaeans. Jesus to them was only one of many sons of light, in an unending succession of them, in an unending battle, to save man's spark of light.
This is key for understanding the role of Stephen in this story. Stephen is a prophet who receives these divine visions from the Fen, and in the end is anointed by King Penda to be one of these sons of light, these guardians of England's sacred flame. Penda was one of them, and Elgar was one of them. After Stephen's dream, we see him avoiding Joel in the morning and then refusing to participate in rugby at school. It's clear that this revelation is causing him much stress and anxiety as he considers himself unworthy. This is the beginning of Stephen's decision to become a non-cooperative, which is a very unfair thing to call him because up to this point, he's been very cooperative. Even though the deck was stacked against him for being a sissy. He tried his best, but his best wasn't good enough. But at this point, the knowledge that he will never fit into his vision of the English norm is shattering his dream of ever being that godly saint he always hoped he was. And he's left in a directionless state with nowhere to turn to for guidance other than his dad, who is starting to seem not as normal as Stephen once assumed. And possibly William Arne, who presents to Stephen an alternative path for the intellectual.
We're not people anymore with eyes to see. We're blind, gaping holes. The end of the production line was stuffing with trash. We're not even citizens. We're dubbed serfs on some mad Great Wall of China project. Our taskmasters, no Hitler, Stalin, or Mao, but our own management class. Their pink fat faces even begin to look alike. There's one hope for man only. When the great concrete megacity chokes the globe from pole to pole, it shall already have bedded in some hidden crack the sacred seed of its own disintegration and collapse. Disobedience, chaos. Out of those alone can some new experiment in human living be born. Here am I subverting you. Your father will be horrified.
Oh, I don't know.
Disobedience, chaos. Out of those alone can some new experiment in human living be born. Arne is advocating for disintegration, precisely the thing that Stephen warned against in his speech at the Sixth Form Debate Club. But at this point, with Stephen unable to conform to society's standards the way he hoped, he's becoming more receptive to this message of disintegration. And this is the phase Stephen goes through in the middle of the movie, the disintegration phase. In order to learn a new way of approaching life, Stephen must first unlearn the old way. He must face the dragon of chaos and be consumed by it if he wants to have hope of coming out the other side a free man. One of his acts of disobedience is crossing the boundary into the blocked-off section of the fen, where the man was burned by the weather balloon mishap. There, he meets a vision of the same angel he saw in his dream. And here, it is revealed that the angel has an androgynous form. This angel is not a man nor a woman. Its sex is mixed. It is therefore impure. This might seem strange to Stephen if he had not met the same angel in the dream of Gerontius.
Gerontius, Greek Gerontos, an old man, has died. The music portrays his experience after death. An angel meets his soul beyond the grave. I think this angel is male. Yet he sings in a woman's voice, which makes him unearthly.
So on the one hand, if it's in a piece of classical music that spiritually resonates with Stephen, androgyny is unearthly and therefore godly. But on the other hand, if androgyny is experienced by Stephen himself as a sissy boy who fancies men, then it is unnatural and therefore from the devil. This is the very same complex we get with the dissonance that is the piercing glance of God. If it's portrayed in such classical colors as The Dream of Gerontius by Edward Elgar, then such dissonance is a brilliant portrayal of the terrifying nature of God's impenetrable death and resolute judgment. If, however, such dissonance comes in the form of the good and evil within a man's soul, the light and darkness that resides in each one of us as the natural mixture of forces that defines what it means to be a human being, then such a mixture is sinful and must be purified by the cleansing light of fire. We'll get to the fire symbolism later on. But the point is, Stephen has already been exposed to this truth he is discovering in the works of Edward Elgar. He just doesn't know it yet. And learning this truth is not only bringing him closer to himself, closer to nature, and closer to England, but it's also bringing him closer to Elgar. And we see evidence later on that that's true when Elgar reveals to him one of his most profound secrets. This angel is the necessary counterweight to the demon he met in his hypnagogic vision. The demon was there to tell Stephen that he needs to come face to face with his unnatural admixture of man and woman. And the angel was there to tell him that this mixture wasn't really demonic or unnatural at all. After that, we get this interesting moment where Joel runs over the bird because Stephen is too nervous around him to tell him about the bird under his tire. I see this moment as a comment on capitalism. Joel is doing his job, unaware of the destruction that he's causing, and unaware of the way the machine he's feeding is stamping out the innocence of life. I think to what the mom says in a later scene where she's chastising Stephen for being a non-cooperative.
Maybe you get called up into the army, you'll end up peeling potatoes. You'll never get into university. You'll finish up on a conveyor belt. Don't you sneer, Stephen. A man cannot leave the belt for one moment without getting a stand-in to take his place. The belt moves on regardless of the needs of men. It gets at a man's heart. The whole rhythm of his life is chained to the machine. It's called productivity, Stephen. I've seen it. All day long, the ambulance is here and never still.
Obviously, this is a critique of capitalism on a humanitarian level, but in the work of David Rudkin, human nature is intimately linked with nature itself. So this is not only a humanitarian message, but also an environmental message about how we destroy the earth in the name of productivity, which is, of course, what the military was doing by building something out in the fen, and why Penda appeared to burn that drunk sheep fucker. Humanity cannot exist without our connection to the natural world. We would lose any sense of what can be considered humanity. Our spirits would never be able to rest. We're then greeted to this pompous dickbag again, shaming Stephen for being a non-cooperative, before the next big episode in Stephen's prophet experience, the garden vision. It's interesting that we see Stephen whistling on his bicycle at the beginning of the scene. It shows that on some level, being a non-cooperative is making Stephen happy. He's starting to feel free of the burden of responsibility that he put on himself his whole life. But of course, it's a give and take. Because despite the feeling of relative freedom it grants him, he still suffers from pangs of shame and embarrassment, and the fear for his immortal soul, which is represented by this flashing image of the demon appearing to him while he's riding his bike, which sends him tumbling to the ground. I like the randomness of this moment. It reminds me a lot of my life. I'll just be walking along, minding my own business, and then I'll think of something shameful or embarrassing or depressing about my life, and it'll just jump at me with not a moment's notice, and suddenly I'm cringing. Actually, there's a pretty funny video about this phenomenon by Dana's Not on Fire called Cringe Attack. I'd recommend it if you're suffering from this problem. So Stephen basically suffers a cringe attack here and goes unconscious with his bicycle wheel spinning. When he wakes up, the wheel is no longer spinning. The first thing he sees is the sign painter peeling away that V that he pasted over to reveal the F that he initially put there, before Stephen corrected his spelling.
You've spelled Pinvin wrong. It's V, not F. Pinvin.
Then he looks at the street sign, and it also says Pinfin with an F, and then Pendaven. This, of course, represents David Rudkin peeling away the layers of history to reveal the origins of the name Pinvin as Penda's Fen, and by extension, peeling away the layers of doctrine fixing and corruption over the course of history to reveal the true ancestral inheritance of England as a pre-Christian country, as a country older than any doctrine revealed to modern man. This is a call to connect right to the source of life, the natural world. It's actually kind of a shamanistic message if you think about it. Cut away the layers of inherited interpretation and learn directly from nature. We then see Stephen walk out into the fen and come across an old-fashioned manor house with a pristine English garden cut into it. It's worth noting the difference between the wild, overgrown fenland and the trimmed and manicured English garden. One is a feature of the natural environment, and the other is the natural environment cut up, tamed, and shoved into little neat boxes to fill the aesthetic desires of its masters. The English garden, as a symbol of prim and proper Englishness, therefore represents the way of the Tory, and the way that Stephen is used to looking at life. Stephen walks into the center of the garden, where he sees a potent display of what this way of life actually does to humanity. In a circle of young people, all dressed in verdant spring colors of yellow and green, there is a bloody tree stump, already symbolic of the destruction of nature, and next to it stands an old man in a suit with a butcher's cleaver. A little girl walks up to the bloody stump, cheerfully puts her hands on it, and the old man cheerfully lops off her hands. The metaphor is clear.
You never grew up to be a big rock star, celebrated victim of your fame. Just cut our wrists like cheap coupons and say that death was on sale today.
It's a statement about the callousness of the older generation selling out the younger generation, or how old men make the decision to send the young to war, to get slaughtered in a bid to protect their financial interests. There's a line by Stephen's father later in the movie that pairs perfectly with this moment.
The pagans practiced human sacrifice.
Do we not? Their millions threw the fire to Moloch, living and dead.
Every day we crucify ourselves, and every day we destroy the earth to hand on nothing but dust to the children of tomorrow. Every day we pass our children through fire to Moloch, taking this youthful, verdant English spring and burning it as an offering to that dreaded machine, productivity. This is the system that they are supporting when they call you a non-cooperative, when they shame you for not going along with their program. It's a sick culture centered on authority and death. The flowering of England's greatness is stunted by its own delusional adherence to tradition. The hands that could be used to accomplish great things are severed from their bodies and tossed aside. And these two, the mother and the father of England, whom Stephen praised earlier in the movie for treating England as a nation of children and preventing the airing of a TV documentary, they appear to beckon Stephen to cooperate, to return to being a cooperative again, to get his hands lopped off and get passed through fire to burn away his sin and become a creature of pure light. But more on that later. When Stephen wakes up, his bicycle wheel is still spinning, which is a great little trick to clue the audience into the fact that it's only been a few seconds in real time, even though Stephen was having this vision that lasted a lot longer in his mind. Unfortunately, the man who wakes him up just happens to be the person he's been afraid to talk to for the last few days. We get this really interesting moment where Joel picks him up, and he's still clearly in a daze, not knowing what's going on, but as soon as he wakes up enough to realize who's holding him, he suddenly lurches away. Like he's just realized the man who awakened his unnatural urges is touching him right now. Bad news. But then, interestingly, Joel does something we haven't seen before. He tries to reassure Stephen. He sees that Stephen is freaked out, and he doesn't let go. He holds on to him to make sure that he's all right.
Hey! Hey! Sorry. Just to help you up. That's all.
I want to bring up something that I actually didn't even notice until recording this video. It seems like the accents of the the two boys, Joel and Honeybone, are much more West Country. They much more talk like this, you know, with the more rhotic dialect. But Stephen has a very upper class dialect, right, like this. And it's interesting, I guess, just because of the way that Clark, he's the guy who actually made the fucking movie. Clark is portraying, I guess, a little bit of like educational difference here, where Stephen is talking more in a received pronunciation, whereas the other kids, the more down-to-earth boys, who are maybe a little bit more sarcastic and mean, are speaking with a more rustic West Country accent. I just wanted to point that out. This is not an editor's note because I'm doing it as I'm recording, but I guess it's just a side note. Anyway, back to the script. This act of kindness is clearly not what Stephen expected from Joel. Up until this point, we've only seen Joel make friendly little jabs at Stephen's expense, basically trying to get him to lighten up and stop being such a square. But here, we see Joel actually seeming to care about Stephen a bit, and physically touching him to show a slight amount of affection. Of course, Stephen, being a heavily repressed homosexual who just woke up from a confusing dream, is a little bit out of it, and he gets a little too comfortable. Like, imagine you fainted, and you wake up to your crush, who has never treated you with any respect before, suddenly showing you a lot of compassion out of nowhere, and holding you and touching you. You might still think you're in a dream. You might be a little carried away with excitement, and that's what happens to Stephen here.
That's all.
I love this moment, how Joel slowly starts to realize what's happening, and he tells Stephen to snap out of it. It's interesting that Joel's girlfriend is sitting in the truck behind him. We don't see her at any other point in the movie, and I think it's because David Rudkin needed another person in this scene to break the tension. It would have been really difficult to end this scene with the two of them just standing there, embarrassed about what just happened, and not knowing how to go forward. But with the girlfriend there, she can interrupt the moment and bring everything back to normal. It also makes me wonder if part of Joel's kindness in this scene is performative. Obviously, Joel is nowhere as mean and cruel as Corporal Honeybone. He's shown to be a generally all-right guy, even if he's a bit disrespectful to Stephen. But hey, Stephen is a stuck-up douchebag, so it goes both ways. But with the girlfriend there, that would give him an extra motivation to go out of his way to help Stephen and appear to be a kind human being. So that's another thing to think about. It also just confirms the fact that Joel is definitely heterosexual, which makes it awkward when Stephen is subtly sexually harassing him right in front of his girlfriend. Overall, it's just a really interesting and well-executed scene with a lot of psychology that you can read into it without a whole lot of dialogue. This might be my favorite moment in the movie. We then get a scene where Stephen is looking through his dad's study to find a book of place names that he remembers being in here somewhere. The reason he's looking for the book of place names is, of course, because he received the vision about Pinvin actually being Pendaven, and he wanted to know if this vision was true, and if so, what revelation it could be pointing him towards. But instead of the book of place names, he finds a different sort of revelation, a sermon that his dad wrote called The Buried Jesus, with a number 2 next to it in parentheses. I say sermon, it's more of a screed against the so-called Christian doctrine fixers like St. Paul and St. Augustine, who in Reverend Franklin's view distorted and malevolently tampered with the story of Jesus to the point where it no longer represented the true man. This, of course, means that Reverend Franklin actually agrees with the kind of deconstructed narrative presented in the documentary Who is Jesus? Which means that Stephen, who always thought of his father, as a pious man, is starting to realize that his father's version of piety has nothing to do with the sort of Anglican Orthodox teaching that he assumed up to this point.
To the reader who shouts blasphemy, I say blasphemy worse. That the name of this life-enhancing revolutionary Jesus should now be dangled like a halo above a sick culture centered on authority and death.
According to Reverend Franklin, the true Jesus never got resurrected. The resurrected Jesus was the fabrication of the churchmen. Whatever Jesus was, in reality, is a mystery, forever lost to time, sealed away in a tomb that never opened. The buried Jesus. We also see Stephen pull out another folder, labeled The Buried Jesus, which I assume is the rough draft version, since it doesn't have the number 2 next to it. Although, when Stephen opens it, it doesn't have anything in it, just a blank sheet of paper. It makes you wonder why this little detail was included in the movie. But if you'll notice, the label on this second folder is so faded that it is nearly gone, which signals to the audience that this is a very old manuscript, and hence, The Buried Jesus is not a new idea from Reverend Franklin. He had the idea for this essay many years ago, possibly when Stephen was just a baby. Stephen's father is not the man Stephen thought he was. But also, the fact that there's nothing in this folder except for a blank page makes me wonder if this is supposed to signal to the audience that Reverend Franklin didn't actually write a rough draft for The Buried Jesus back when he created this folder. Perhaps he put the piece of paper in there with the intention of writing on it, but he never did, as if he wasn't as fearless back then as he is now. Perhaps his instinct of self-censorship was too strong, and he worried about committing an act of blasphemy. Perhaps that's why the quote we heard from his voice was about the accusation of blasphemy. Perhaps he was heading off this criticism at the pass in his second draft, precisely because it was the self-criticism that prevented him from writing the first draft all those many years ago. And yet he kept the folder around in his study to fade over time, because he knew that this was an important message. He just didn't have the courage to write it yet. It's interesting how the tiniest visual details in this scene can tell us so much about the backstory of this character. And this is all stuff that I didn't even notice until my most recent viewing. A couple of scenes later, we get Stephen's father writing a letter explaining Stephen's decision to cancel his military apprenticeship, where we hear him write this interesting sentence.
I can only assume that he is now finding some other cause in which to invest his national pride.
This is very in keeping with the idea of this movie that it is not whether Stephen loves England that is called into question, but how he should show this love. This is something that Stephen's father understands, as he is one of the best, most supportive fathers I've ever seen on film. He really seems to understand everything that Stephen is going through at all times, and he never makes an effort to change Stephen or tell him he's wrong or push him in a different direction. Instead, he just gives Stephen little guideposts along the way. When Stephen comes to him for advice, he gives him advice, and this breeds a lot of trust between the two of them. He's the perfect example of a person who leads by example and uses the gentle, passive force to overcome obstacles, letting Stephen mostly figure out everything for himself.
Well, I can only assume it's because you hanker suddenly to join what I term your generation's underside. You've never wholeheartedly subscribed, have you, Franklin, to the traditions of the school?
Oh my fucking god, I can't with these people. They all act like Stephen didn't try his absolute best to fit in and do as he was told. Meanwhile, dickbags like Honeybone are just goofing off and not learning anything, while Stephen is trying his hardest to be a model citizen. But none of the authority figures in his life seem to understand that. Not even his mother understands that. Although I can understand from her point of view that it's more just frustration out of worry for Stephen. Like, she really does care for him and worries about his future now that he's out of love with the school. But these schoolmasters are just such ungrateful dickheads. They fail to appreciate all the service that Stephen has given them over the years. They fail to understand the challenges that Stephen goes through. And they interpret him being bad at sports as some sort of slight against them and their traditions. As if it's his fault that he's a social outcast because he takes the school traditions far more seriously than his classmates. But then he gets a ration of shit for it when the pressure becomes too much for him. It's so backwards. And it shows how little appreciation and compassion there is. There's no attempt to console Stephen or understand the grief that he's going through. It's a very British kind of casual callousness, like, oh, he's reneging his apprenticeship. He must have never believed in our message from the start. Let's shame him and move on.
Well, I can only assume it's because you hanker suddenly to join what I term your generation's underside.
There's no humanity in the system. As soon as you reach your breaking point, you just become another bad example to show the rest of the kids. See? This is what failure looks like. It's a disgrace. Cut from that grueling scene to a rainstorm in the fen. Stephen takes cover in an abandoned shelter where he meets the ghost of Edward Elgar, by this point an elderly man in a wheelchair.
Holy, strong, but come to judge me. From the depths I prayed for thee. Where did I pluck the sublimity of that? From the angels, from the air? From a dog. His owner refused to give him a bone. By Gerontius' transcendental deathbed cry, I music from the wine of a dog for his bone.
This is another example of the shamanistic practice of learning from nature, and it shows that Elgar's music, as much as it has the character of divine inspiration, is ultimately music of the earth. Its source of divine inspiration is the divinity of nature, the divinity of small things, petty things, things of the flesh. He then tells a story about how he yelled at a little girl for singing a song that was written for his wife, and then another story about how he watched surgeons cut half of his stomach out from a mirror in the ceiling. I'm not really sure what the significance of these stories is. It's all done in this one shot, and it's a rather dull portion of the scene, but things get clearer again when he asks Stephen if anyone has figured out which tune fits with his Enigma theme.
Well, they have tried combining your theme with all sorts of tunes. Old Lang Syne in the minor, even God Save the King. None of the combinations is really convincing.
The tune that fits is under all their noses, but they won't spot it, because, you see, they have no demon for counterpoint. Shall I tell you what it is? Yes, come here.
That, sir. That!
Sing it. Hear how my tune combines with that.
Bump.
Now, shh. You're like one of the lunatics from the asylum where I taught. In your head, boy, do you want all the world to know?
After Elgar gives Stephen the secret tune, he tells him never to tell anybody about it.
It's a secret between the hills, yourself, and me.
It's clear that Edward in this scene is meant to impart something deeper than just a knowledge of his music. He entrusts it to Stephen as if it's sacred knowledge that only the few elect can be trusted with, like he's an inductee of a mystery school. He's a prophet, essentially, and he is given access to the wisdom of the previous prophet, Elgar, the music of the earth that gives him an understanding of the earth and of England, which is the earth, that no regular man can be entrusted with. And yet, it's a tune that was resting right under the noses of every musician who tried to crack the enigma. The solution was hiding in plain sight. Something mundane and small, that people would generally not think to look at, and yet it hides within it the key to understanding one of music's greatest mysteries. Much like the whining dog that Elgar used as inspiration for Gerontius. It's shamanistic in that way. Instead of looking to something highbrow, an esoteric interpretation of nature, you can access the wisdom of nature straight from the source, as lowbrow and unassuming as it might be. After the bad car ride with his mother, Stephen is finally told that he is adopted. And while this might have upset him if he were told at the beginning of the movie, the work that he has already undergone to liberate himself from his old mindset is actually taking effect now. He doesn't mind that he is adopted, and in fact, it only makes him curious about the new possibilities he faces.
Like a molecule in a way. Some of what goes to make me up I know. But now there are unknown elements, possibilities.
Pretty convenient for his parents that he happened to be going through a journey of self-discovery right at the time when they designated to tell him that he was adopted. The person he comes to talk to about it is Mrs. Arne, because he knows that she can't have children. It's an interesting moment because, first of all, we see Mrs. Arne literally grappling with nature in a rather unhappy way, muttering PG-13 curses to herself while she fucks around in the weeds. But while Mrs. Arne is physically grappling with nature, she is also mentally grappling with nature. Her inability to have children is something she feels very bitter about.
I only hope you and your future wife will make a better chemical compound than us two.
It's interesting that she says this right after Stephen very not so subtly implies that he is gay.
Can a homosexual have children?
They make very good fathers, I'm told.
I want to have children.
Lady, are you not paying attention? It's kind of an interesting moment because Stephen is coming to her to get some understanding of his own situation. Because she is a person who can't have children and therefore might have tried to adopt children in the past, and he is also coming to the realization that he can't have children, even though he would like to, but also that he himself is adopted. Ultimately, though, the scene doesn't really do much for the story. Mrs. Arne doesn't have a whole lot to say about her situation or Stephen's. She doesn't even really understand what he's trying to tell her. Or maybe she's just being polite about it. And honestly, I'm not even sure whether Stephen was trying to tell her. Up to this point, he hasn't told anyone about his homosexuality, not even his dad. And he never does for the rest of the film. But I think being in the closet upsets him now that he understands what he is. And little moments like these might be him testing the waters to see whether he wants to commit to coming out or not. I guess the subtext of this moment is more interesting than the text. We then get a very sporadic moment in the school gymnasium where everyone is in military uniform except for Stephen, who is in academic uniform. The cadets are all crowding around Stephen to put a pink ribbon in his hair. Honeybone forces him to let go of the ribbon, and then all of the boys whistle and shout with glee. But then awkwardness ensues as Stephen just stoically rotates to look each one of them in the eyes, and something about his gaze affects them. They quiet down immediately. Even Honeybone's smirk disappears. And then he walks away. This has been a big-lipped alligator moment, a scene that appears out of nowhere, doesn't make sense in context, and has no impact on the story whatsoever. Well, not really. It is an interesting moment, though, because of just how dreamlike it feels. In fact, I'm not even entirely sure it's not a dream. For one thing, we have no idea what these cadets are supposed to be doing in this gymnasium, why they are all in uniform, and why Stephen is with them. If Stephen is no longer doing his military apprenticeship, he shouldn't even be there in the first place. Or if he is there, why isn't he in uniform like the rest of them? And where are the teachers? There seems to be nobody in this gymnasium except for Stephen and the boys. Why? What were they doing here? And there's no dialogue, just nonverbal shouts and whistles. And then to top it off, how did Stephen get these boys to quiet down just by looking at them? Is that really all it took? They got this far tying a pink ribbon in his hair, but the stony look of disapproval just shuts them down completely. They don't know how to react. What were they expecting him to do? Just take the ribbon out, cry like a baby, run and hide? I don't know. It's just a strange moment how all of these bullies suddenly go quiet. Like, Stephen suddenly holds all the power in this situation. And it's not entirely clear why. But I guess what we do see in this moment is that this is the first time Stephen has really acted like a man.
Begin to wonder, Franklin.
Yeah. We get it. This is the first time Stephen behaved towards someone with a real sense of inner dignity, even as he is put in the undignified position of having a girly pink ribbon tied into his hair. He doesn't even try to pull the ribbon out. He's just like, this is what you do. You put a ribbon in my hair. Well, let me judge you for it. How does that feel? And of course, we have to ask why they are putting the ribbon in his hair in the first place. We know that Joel knows that Stephen wants his dick, but we don't know how the other students found out about it. Did Joel really spill the beans on Stephen? Did Joel actually go around blabbing that Stephen is a homosexual? And if so, how did he do it? Did he mention Stephen sexually harassing him in front of his girlfriend? Or did he not go into the details? How much detail would someone like Joel go into in describing this scene, if any at all? And what would motivate Joel to do such a thing? How exactly did Stephen patch things up with Joel? What happened in this scene? We never see the two of them interact again in the film. What was going through Joel's mind during this moment? We know that he figured out what was going on in Stephen's head, that much is clear, but we don't know exactly what was going on in his head. Was he deeply disturbed by this incident? Did it bother him on an emotional level? Did it surprise him? Was he totally unaware of Stephen's homosexuality up to this point, and it changed the way he thought about him? That Franklin boy fancies me. He's right puff to that one. Caught him trying to make moves, see? Can you believe it? That boy wants it in the arse, I tell you. Don't give it to him. I don't know, I'm just curious how this information got out, if it got out at all. We don't actually have any evidence that it was this moment that sealed Stephen's fate. The pink ribbon might have just been because he's a wimp who dropped out of his military apprenticeship. They might be calling him a Nazi just as a way to insult him with no actual confirmation about his sexuality one way or the other. It's left unanswered what happened here, why it happened, and how it happened. And it's left unanswered what happened to his relationship with Joel. Did he just keep hiding from him after this point? I like to imagine that they keep seeing each other after that moment, but they don't talk much. They just exchange mutual looks like, yeah, I remember what happened. I'm not going to say anything, but we both know what happened. Maybe they even have brief conversations where the tension is so thick you can cut it with a knife. I don't know. I like the fact that it was left open to the imagination, but I also think it would have been interesting to have one extra scene with Joel. We then get a scene with Reverend Franklin sitting with an old woman as her husband dies, but despite him being there, he isn't actually doing much other than sitting. He even offers to pull the cover over the man's head, but she stops him. His presence here feels more obligatory than anything. You could say he is just there to have someone else in the room for her, and while that's a perfectly fine use of his time, he then gets up and just leaves her there without even saying goodbye. I think I might be overanalyzing the details of this scene, but it does feel a little odd for him to just get up and leave the room, and then leave the house entirely in the next moment. It probably doesn't mean much, but the reason I'm paying attention to these details is that Reverend Franklin is an interesting character, and much of his story is told through subtext rather than text, like the stuff about the buried Jesus essay. So, with this scene in the movie, it must be trying to tell us something about Reverend Franklin. More details of this character will come in the following scene, his long dusk conversation with Stephen. That might be the most important and memorable stretch of dialogue in the movie.
When you heard the call of God, was it a real voice?
Any voice you hear is real.
But outside your head, was God's voice to you outside your head?
No burning bush, if that's what you mean.
Of course, Stephen has heard voices outside of his head, but up until this point, he has not heard the voice of God. He has seen an angel and a demon. He has heard the voice of Edward Elgar. He has seen the true enemies of England dismember their progeny, but he hasn't heard God yet. However, his propensity for visions is making him consider the possibility that he may be, in some sense, a prophet. and here he tries to get some information out of his dad to determine whether he has experienced something similar. And of course, the answer is no.
Joan of Arc heard voices.
Joan was a witch.
The English only burnt her for one because she was a patriot of France.
There is some evidence that she might even have not been Christian, but that she practiced what is called the old religion, the primitive religion of the villages and fields.
She worshipped the devil.
Stephen, when a church, any church, goes to war against an older god, it has to call that older god the devil.
Despite the connection that Stephen has made to King Penda, that his vision was clearly prompting him to see, he still hasn't quite shaken his conditioning against paganism. As if anybody of Stephen's education level would actually think that the pagans worshipped the devil. It's such a silly idea. Although, to be fair, Georges Sorel, as smart as he was, thought that Jews in Eastern Europe were ritually sacrificing people, so But does he not know where the days of the week come from? But here we get the first mention of Joan of Arc, which, even though it only comes in during the last quarter of the movie, becomes a very important motif. Although actually it shows up much earlier than that, like the beginning of the movie, for instance, with the burning hand, or the part where Brought the Sheep Fucker gets burned. Immolation is what we're talking about, destruction by fire. And in the old days, immolation meant specifically the sacrifice of an offering through fire. Burning a heretic, even if it's for political reasons, is essentially just that. It's a way to purify the world through the cleansing act of fire, to take refracted light and make it whole again, to destroy diversity by sacrificing our children in the act of Moloch.
In her last moment, we are told, Joan screamed through the flames to Jesu. Jesu. Whom did she see? The plaster Christ of the cathedrals, or her old elemental village god, the son of Adam, son of man, the torn, flayed hero bleeding on the tree, the old man god, unchanging, ever-changing. Samson, Marduk, Jesus, Balder, Heracles.
Okay, so here we're getting into The Golden Bough by James George Frazer, which is the foundational text of comparative mythology. It's from way back in the day when every nonfiction book had like 7 volumes to it. James Frazer identified the dying god archetype in various mythologies around the world, where a god of some sort of positive trait is tortured, executed, and then resurrected. This obviously has some connection to the changing seasons and blah blah blah. Of the gods whom Reverend Franklin mentioned, Balder is probably the most relevant to our area, seeing how information about Balder comes out of Icelandic sources, and he is therefore what we would call a Norse god, and would have likely been known by the English too. The story of Balder's death and resurrection might have even been known by Penda himself. How Balder's blind brother was tricked by Loki into hurling a sharp javelin of mistletoe at him, killing him. Balder's death was a great tragedy to his family, the Aesir, and it also signaled the beginning of Ragnarok, the end times, after which Balder would be resurrected. In addition to Balder's story, there is also the time the Icelandic god Odin was said to have hanged himself in sacrifice as an offering to himself in order to gain knowledge of the runes. In the poem Hávamál, Odin identifies the tree as the tree that none may know what root beneath it runs. Most people have interpreted this to mean that he's talking about Yggdrasil, the great tree that lives at the center of creation and holds up the 9 worlds of the Germanic cosmos. There's a book by a scholar named G. Ronald Murphy called Tree of Salvation, which compiles evidence from Old Norse religious art and stave churches to demonstrate his theory that the Old Norse Christians identified Yggdrasil with the cross that Jesus was hanged on. And of course, the English name for Odin is Woden, where we get the word Wednesday, and King Penda himself claimed descent from Woden on his family tree. So, in a sense, Penda, like Jesus, is the son of a god, or at least a descendant of one of the gods. So Reverend Franklin here is showing that he's a man of pretty open-minded culture. Obviously, we knew that about him already based on his conversations with William Arne, but here it's made pretty clear that he must have read The Golden Bough. And by the way, this is not the only Play for Today special from the time period that referenced The Golden Bough. Robin Redbreast from 1970 also mentioned it.
Study of religions is one of my many interests. I am a reading man, you know.
Known for it.
The goddess of fertility in the old legends was in some ways like yourself, Miss Palmer. Not a married lady, but nevertheless, if you'll excuse the freedom, not a virgin either. In the autumn, she would couple with the young king.
King?
He'd be treated like a king. Served and pampered, you might say. And then, of course...
Killed?
He would pass away, yes. Assisted to it, you might say. And from his blood, the crops would spring.
A Greek legend, Mr. Fisher.
And Egyptian, Mexican, many places. You must read a book by Sir James Fraser, The Golden Bough, in 7 volumes.
But not an English legend.
Robin Hood, Robin of the Dale, even Robin Redbreast, one of the very birds in your garden.
Actually, Robin Redbreast is an interesting movie because it has some similarities to The Wicker Man, a movie that came out in 1973, the year before Penda's Fen, and 3 years after Robin Redbreast. All 3 of these movies deal with paganism as a central theme, although Penda's Fen is probably the most idealized portrayal. In Penda's Fen, paganism idealizes the pre-Christian and therefore pre-doctrinaire past of England in order to fit David Rudkin's eco-anarchist agenda, the villager agenda.
You know the old meaning of pagan as well as I do.
Belonging to the village.
The village is sneered at as something petty. Petty it can be. Yet it works. The scale is human. People can relate there. Man may yet in the nick of time revolt and save himself. Revolt from the monolith, come back to the village.
This is one of the most important lines in the movie. I even quoted it in a recent video about fascism. Revolt from the monolith, come back to the village. But what does it mean? Well, key to this idea is the term revolt. In the next breath, Reverend Franklin says that Jesus was a revolutionary. And that is indeed one interpretation of the gospel that I have heard. Even Marilyn Manson loves this interpretation, and he used it as inspiration for a couple of his albums. We could call it a Christian anarchist interpretation, the Jesus who offered a radical new way of life, free from the bonds of capital and king, where everyone was an equal, everyone lived communally, and with a kind and generous heart. This is a vision that you can read into the Gospels if you ignore the epistles. The epistles were written by St. Paul, who had a much more orthodox, right-wing view of Christianity, although to give him some credit, he did have the idea of expanding the gospel outside of Jewish circles to become a universal message of salvation. Reverend Franklin is very critical of St. Paul and St. Augustine, and he compares these people to the socialists who followed Karl Marx, and in his view, perverted the radical genius of Marx's revolutionary message.
He has been taken over, just as Marx was taken over. Perverted by the Pauls, Augustines, Constantines, the institution mongers, the doctrine men. We crucify him over and over. Over and over in that church, I crucify him.
I love this idea that the real Judas kiss, the real betrayal of Jesus, is not from the unbelievers, but rather from the doctrine fixers and institution mongers who try to fit Jesus into a box that they can sell to other people in order to acquire power and money, or to establish some kind of orthodoxy to legislate the message into something codified, sterile, and politically correct. Something that respects the established order. Something that goes against the original anti-establishment views of Jesus the Rebel, or of Karl Marx, who envisioned an anarchistic society of egalitarian producers where the need for state authority would gradually dissolve due to the resolution of the material dialectic, rather than what we got, which was a paranoid, ruthless authoritarian regime that yoked the producers even more tightly than ever before. That's what you get when you value doctrine over message, when you take a rebellious message of ungovernableness and turn it into an orthodoxy with an established clergy. It becomes the new Caesar, the new Babylon, the new Antichrist. David Rudkin made another movie called White Lady, which was a parable about pesticides. This man is trying to take care of his 2 daughters off the grid with an organic lifestyle, but then his 2 daughters discover this lady in white, surrounded by a bunch of ripe fruit. She tells the children to eat the fruit, and it is revealed that the white tablecloths, which match the lady's white dress, are actually covering up barrels of toxic waste. The film is intercut with little clips showing the degeneration of plant and animal reproductive systems that happen because of pesticides. The message is clear. Pesticides might offer an attractive alternative to the hard, grueling work of maintaining an organic garden, and they might make it easier to feed a large population. But David Rudkin is skeptical of large populations, because with large populations we end up destroying the earth and destroying ourselves in the process. All day long the ambulances here are never still, and your children will end up with birth defects. Isn't that lovely? What David Rudkin seems to want for us is to return to a smaller existence, an organic existence, like the one the Arn family is living. And sometimes it's not very pleasant. That scene with Mrs. Arn cursing at the weeds is a pretty good inclusion for that reason. Organic life, village life, is not an idyllic fantasy, but it is healthy. It's a type of life that connects us better with our surroundings. And this is also made clear in White Lady. I mean, the dad is shown having a really hard time trying to keep his daughters under control while doing all this work, and sometimes he snaps at them. I mean, it's not portrayed as a particularly happy existence, but it is shown as the only good alternative to this kind of destruction. Instead of having our heads lost in the abstractions of metropolitan business, without a real home or a real community, living in whatever hole you can carve out and shutting the blinders to keep away the demons of the street, it's probably better for us to live a more petty lifestyle, where we do have a sense of community, where we do visit our parish hall meetings and keep up with the local goings-on, and we don't use up any more than we need. Of course, the driving factor in all of this dynamic, productivist machine living is capitalism. Take capitalism out of the equation and replace it with a more egalitarian and less profit-motivated economy, a village-based economy, an economy of equal producers, and we might start to view our communities with a little less indifference, knowing, of course, that our labor is actually valued enough that we are brought into the fold and made an equal producer. Thus, in an act of rebellion, in choosing to revolt from the monolithic existence of capitalism, we might find ourselves a better, more sustainable life in the village. Of course, the socialist aspect of the film's messaging is mostly subtextual. I think this reference to Marx and Arn's diatribe about the strike at the beginning of the film are the only two major references to socialism in the movie, as well as perhaps the mother's little screed on productivity, but that was less political and more personal, talking about Stephen's future as a member of the social machine. The libertarian side of the film's anarchism takes a more prominent role in the storytelling, the anti-government, anti-church angle. And this makes sense because this film is less about capitalism and more about heresy. It's about liberating the individual to be a heretic in as much as he desires, and thus liberating the true dynamic creative spirit of England that has been bottled up for so long in this stereotypical mold, by reminding us that this mold is not England's only heritage, and that there is a much older heritage to England than Christian Toryism, but also that the truth is always somewhere in the middle, that purity is an illusion, that the piercing glance of God is not an angelic harmony, but rather a cacophony of dissonant noises. The vulnerable spark of light in man is not purity, it is an illumination of our own impurity. Dark, true, impure, and dissonant. That is a truth that cannot be contained, that cannot be put into a little box and sold as some sort of ideal. That is what we must accept about ourselves if we are to have any hope of saving ourselves through this act of rebellion. So why, if Reverend Franklin crucifies Jesus every week in that church by continuing to support the Anglican perversion, the Pauline Nicene Creed, why does Reverend Franklin stay frocked? Why doesn't he abandon the church?
Because like all of us in this world, I am two men, a self and a non-self. Only by being non-selves can we now survive in our own mortal shrouds we weave around us. And what shall this survival profit us? In this day of the mask, this day of corporation man, what shall the self do then, poor thing, but curl away in from the poisoning wind and dream? Dream of some second coming man himself must bring about, through some last disobedience and new resurrection.
To curl away in from the poisoning wind and dream. I love that line. There's so much he's saying here about our modern condition, about how we, as automaton worker drones, have to put on a mask to survive. Reverend Franklin is a parson because it's his job to be a parson. It's the mask that he put on to play his role in society. I get the sense that when he got into Christianity seriously and studied to be a parson, he had some great inspiration that told him that his calling in life was to help people in a spiritual way, to be there for his community as a spiritual leader and guide. And so he got into Christianity in order to do that. But the longer he stayed in this system, the more he felt that he couldn't do that job, and the uglier it got to him, until he became jaded with it. His readings of Fraser, Marx, Jung, and many other free-thinking writers got him to question the doctrine that he was pigeonholed into upholding as sacred, and it made the whole system feel rotten to the core, especially when he could see all the damage that it was doing to people in his son's situation who didn't fit into society's standard of purity and yet felt enormous pressure to conform. It really makes me wonder how Stephen managed to even become so radicalized in the Tory direction when he had a dad who was so open-minded. But up until this point, it seems like Franklin never really wanted to talk to Stephen about these things. Perhaps for the same reason that he never started writing his rough draft of the Buried Jesus. Perhaps his own sense of guilt at himself having failed in his job as a man of the church made him insecure about these doubts, and he figured Stephen would be better off learning how to figure things out for himself. But of course, Stephen went through the school system and got a military education, ending up a real tosser, much like how they agreed to tell Stephen that he was adopted on his 18th birthday, even though they could have told him much earlier and it probably would have been better for him if they did. Their insecurity and fear over this prospect made them hesitate, and the longer they put it off, the worse it got. Perhaps that's one area where Franklin failed, but his son will succeed. Perhaps Franklin got a little too comfortable living as his non-self, and curling away in from the poisoning wind so that he could idly dream about some second coming of Jesus the Rebel, some great revolution in the head, where people would finally learn to live for today, as in the John Lennon song Imagine. But of course, if Franklin is unwilling to put these ideals into practice, all he can do is live this uncomfortable lie, and shrink ever deeper into his white collar until he becomes like a turtle hiding in his shell. I think the real beauty of Franklin's story in this movie is that he learns to find hope in his son, that his son might not make the same mistakes he made, that his son might have the bravery and self-assuredness to live the life that he always wanted to live, and to do his part to nurture England's sacred demon of ungovernableness in a truly rebellious way, not in the idle way that he did.
Yes, there is need of a book to argue this. Perhaps you might give the world just such a book. Stephen, where fathers fail, they look to their sons to achieve.
But Franklin's story is universal. All of us, at one time or another, experience living life as someone else, living life as a people pleaser, living in fear of being different, or in fear of losing our jobs, or in fear of alienating the community of indoctrinated sheep that we care so much about. It takes a lot to live life as your authentic self. Perhaps that's something Franklin admires about William Arne. Even if Franklin doesn't agree with everything Arne believes, and I have reason to suspect he doesn't, it still doesn't take anything away from the fact that Arne is a good-hearted person who has the strength to stand up for what he believes in. And I honestly think that Reverend Franklin's desire to let Stephen figure things out for himself is very much rooted in his respect for Stephen, in his assuredness and understanding of the fact that Stephen is a very smart person and a very wise person underneath all of his conditioning. His assuredness that Stephen will figure it out, even if he isn't explicitly told. I think this shows a profound amount of love and respect for his son, and I think it's a really profound aspect of this character and this movie. Reverend Franklin is a man of faith, and he's a man of the truly admirable kind of faith that I really admire. I think if we are to understand faith as a virtue at all, and I think we can understand it as such, then Franklin is the best example of what I'm talking about, because he doesn't believe in things without evidence, and yet he doesn't let fear get in the way of what he knows to be true.
I'm not your chemical son, Dad. I wouldn't inherit your understanding.
No knowing, son, what you might not inherit.
I like this line because it's really hard to understand. It reminds me of that part in Lord of the Rings where he says, I don't know half of you half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve. It's a compliment that sounds like an insult. The use of the double negative makes it confusing. No knowing what you might not inherit. I think what Franklin is doing is taking Stephen's concern that he won't inherit the good things about his dad and flipping it around. He also won't inherit the bad things. But then, as Stephen said, there are other possibilities. Unknown potential.
The world would have become this present bedlam, church or no. Yet I wonder. Romanticism of a sort, I know, and yet I wonder. Just as I wonder whom Joan of Arc in her last agony saw. I wonder about another, a man, 1,000 years even earlier than she. King of Midland England. This, last of his kind, last pagan king in England, fighting his last battle against the new machine. That battle in which he is to fall. King Penda. What mystery of this land went down with him forever? What wisdom? When Penda fell, what dark old son of light went out?
Did Penda die here?
Who says that he is dead?
And thus we round off this great scene with Stephen finally realizing the full significance of his Pinfin Pendaven vision. How in some way this apparition was trying to communicate to him this sense of romanticism that his father was feeling. The question, What if? It's smart that Rudkin chooses to point out the fact that the world would have become this present Bedlam church or no. It shows that the pagan symbolism isn't meant to be taken literally. It's not like Rudkin is saying paganism is better than Christianity, or that the world would have been a better place if Christianity hadn't overtaken the noble savage religion of the village. And yet, he wonders. We can't help but wonder. We can't help but ask ourselves if we missed a better version of our world. Of course, there's no way of knowing that. And as Stephen pointed out, the pagans did practice human sacrifice. After all, the ending to The Wicker Man can be traced back directly to the pages of the Gallic Wars by Julius Caesar, who wrote about seeing French pagans doing exactly that, burning people alive in big wicker effigies. And even the practice of Moloch, which Franklin brought up earlier in this scene, was an example of human sacrifice that occurred among the pagans in Carthage. So it's not like the pagans were immune from the same kind of cruelty and human sacrifice that the institution men practice today. And yet, we have, from the 19th century onward, a growing feeling of nostalgia for something older and more rooted than the plaster Christ of the cathedrals. We see it in The Wind in the Willows, where Rat and Mole encounter the Greek god Pan, who at once feels out of place in this humdrum turn-of-the-century English countryside, and yet totally in place and in his element as an ancient guardian of nature, fitting for a country as ancient and historied as England, as he introduces our characters into a mysterious and anomalously psychedelic side of the wilderness. We see it in J.R.R. Tolkien's effort to construct a mythology for England, which hasn't had its proper mythology since the days of Penda. We see it in the rise of English neo-paganism and neo-druidry during the 19th and 20th centuries with characters such as William Butler Yeats, Aleister Crowley, and Gerald Gardner. And we even see it in a growing consciousness of the Celts among the archaeological community and the rise of Celticism. In all of this, I think, there is a dialectic. Nostalgia can only be brought about by change. Mr. Toad's motor car, and before that, the railroad, permanently altered the countryside and made England a much smaller place. I think about what Thomas Hughes wrote about in Tom Brown's School Days. Oh, young England, you who are born into these racing railroad times when there's a great exhibition or some monster sight every year and you can get over a couple of 1,000 miles of ground for £3.10 and a 5 weeks holiday. Why don't you know more of your own birthplaces? You're all in the ends of the earth, it seems to me, as soon as you get your necks out of the educational collar for midsummer holidays, long vacations, or whatnot, going round Ireland with a return ticket in a fortnight, dropping your copies of Tennyson on the tops of Swiss mountains, or pulling down the Danube in Oxford racing boats. And when you get home for a quiet fortnight, you turn the steam off and lie on your backs in the paternal garden, surrounded by the last batch of books from Mudi's library and half bored to death. Well, I know it has its good side. You all patter French, more or less, and perhaps German. You have seen men in cities, no doubt, and have your opinions, such as they are, about schools of painting, high art, and all that. Have seen the pictures of Dresden and the Louvre, know the taste of sauerkraut. All I say is that you don't know your own lanes and woods and fields. Though you may be choke-full of science, not 1 in 20 of you knows where to find the wood sorrel or bee orchid which grow in the next wood, or on the down 3 miles off, or what bog bean and wood sage are good for. And as for the country legends, the stories of the old gable-ended farmhouses, the place where the last skirmish was fought in the Civil Wars, where the parish butts stood, where the last highwaymen turned to bay, where the last ghost was laid by the parson, they're gone and out of date altogether. Now, in my time, when we got home by the old coach, which put us down at the crossroads with our boxes the first day of the holidays, and had been driven off by the family coachman singing Dulce Domum at the top of our voices, there we were, fixtures till Black Monday came around. We had to cut out our own amusements within a walk or a ride of home, and so we got to know all the country folk and their ways and songs and stories by heart, and went over the fields and woods and hills again and again till we made friends of them all. We were Berkshire or Gloucestershire or Yorkshire boys, and you were young cosmopolites, belonging to all countries and no countries. No doubt it's all right. I dare say it is. This is the day of large views and glorious humanity and all that. But I wish backsword play hadn't gone out in the Vale of the White Horse, and that confounded Great Western hadn't carried away Alfred's Hill to make an embankment. I will eventually make a video about the Uffington White Horse, where we'll see this passage again. If studying the past helps us to appreciate what we have today, then experiencing change can help us appreciate what we had in the past, and it can inspire many of the more poetic-minded of us to the primordial, a feeling that there must have been some mystic core to this land we occupy, that the land might very well be alive, and have a memory that stretches back thousands of years, a memory that we are at risk of wiping out if we lose touch with it. Who says Penda is dead? The ancient memory of this peat fen still lives on. All one has to do is get in touch with it. Understand the earth, and you might just be able to speak to Penda, or at least walk the same hills he walked and Elgar walked, and hear the old man whistling from beyond the grave. In the next scene, Stephen visits the parish church once more to play The Dream of Gerontius on the pipe organ. The page is marked as the motif of judgment. As Stephen plays, a crack opens up in the church aisle, and it continues to widen. But he quickly gets bored of this section and flips the page over to the part labeled Angel's Triumph, which is the same section that he was listening to at the beginning of the movie. The part Stephen chooses to begin at is where Gerontius approaches the throne of God, and we hear his ominous footsteps, anticipating what the piercing glance of God will look like, or in the case of this opera, sound like. By this point, the crack in the floor is so wide that a man could easily fall in. Fall to hell, perhaps? In this moment, Stephen is reliving the beginning of the movie, where he was meditating on his own divine judgment and the fate of his immortal soul. Only by this point, he has had so many life-changing experiences in such a short span of time that it gives him an entirely different context for listening to this piece. In the beginning of the movie, he was listening to an LP, but at the end of the movie, he is playing it himself on the organ. It is no longer Gerontius who is cautiously stepping toward the throne of God. It is Stephen himself. Every note he plays is another step he takes, noble, curious, and willing to accept whatever judgment is laid upon him. In the beginning of the movie, his mother comes in and blueballs him right at the most important part of the music. It's symbolic of the fact that at this point in Stephen's life, he is almost ready to see God, but not quite. He hasn't gone through enough life experience that he needs to be able to understand the glimpse of God, even if he did see it. But at this moment, at the end of the film, Stephen is ready, and we finally hear it.
Reverend Franklin, unbury me. Free me from this tree.
This is an incredible moment of filmmaking. You know how I said this scene was my favorite? Fuck that. This scene is my favorite. Last time I watched this movie, I let out an audible wow after this moment. This is the moment the whole movie has been building up to, and it's astonishing. The first chord Stephen plays actually isn't that bad, but then he layers on the second half of it, and it sounds so frighteningly dissonant and chaotic. And this is the moment when God finally decides to show up and greet Stephen himself. But instead of seeing his face, we only see his bloody feet in the mirror as he whispers Stephen's name and tells him, "Unbury me. Free me from this tree." I think it was an especially great idea to have Stephen's foot remain on the drone pedal for the next 30 seconds as the audience contemplates what we just witnessed. It keeps the tension in the atmosphere as we wind down from this moment.
I actually hadn't even listened to this portion of the Dream of Gerontius, to be honest, before I made this video. So I actually didn't even know what the Glance of God sounded like in the original opera. And so, in case you were curious, this is what it sounds like. Yeah, Stephen wasn't kidding when he said it was a brief, little fearful dissonance. It is quite brief in the actual opera, but Stephen obviously really lengthens it and dwells on it when he plays it on the organ, which fits the scene very well.
The line, "Free me from this tree," obviously reminds us of the story of Odin and, every other dying god archetype, but it reminds me of a Marilyn Manson song called "God Eat God," where he says, "Dear God, do you want to tear your knuckles down and hold yourself? Dear God, can you climb off that tree, meet in the shape of a T?" It's an interesting statement made in the form of a prayer, addressing God in a critical way, asking him if it's really necessary to commit a violent act of murder-suicide, and then dangle it over us to guilt trip us into worshiping him. The Jesus of this movie appears to think the same way. "Take me off of this tree," says Jesus, "and unbury me. Let my true message be heard for the first time since I was killed by the same doctrine mongers who crucify me every week in this church over and over." Jesus didn't want to be crucified, and yet the doctrine fixers make a martyr out of him. This movie does not view martyrdom favorably. As the next Manichaean prophet, Stephen has been assigned this task to do what his father before him could not. In a way, what Jesus is doing here is flipping the script. Stephen approaches him with the intent of accepting his own divine judgment, but Jesus gets Stephen to question how he has been judging him this whole time, how Stephen has been judging his Lord incorrectly as a puritanical, judgmental tyrant who must be supplicated to and deferred to at all costs to save his immortal soul. That is not how Jesus wants to be viewed. This whole time, Stephen hasn't had the slightest bit of love for Jesus. He's been living in fear and resentment of his Lord from the very beginning. Stephen, unknowingly, has been playing the role of the judge in this scenario. Jesus has been Gerontius the whole time. And now it's time to free himself from that responsibility and free Jesus from his crucifixion. To those who shout blasphemy, I say blasphemy worse. Then we get this short little penultimate scene that every time I watch this movie, I forget it existed. I swear, I recently watched this movie like a few months ago, and as I was writing this video, I saw this scene. I was like, I forgot this even existed. I was treating this scene as if I had never seen it before. It felt like a new deleted scene to me. But anyway, it's some sort of an assembly the students are in, maybe a pre-graduation assembly or something, I'm not sure. But the headmaster starts reciting a poem that actually resonates with Stephen quite a lot, which is interesting because the headmaster has thus far been entirely out of touch with Stephen. But He says, "And did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's mountains green, and was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills?" It's a poem from William Blake, published in 1804 as a preface to his epic poem Milton. The rest of it goes, "And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills? Bring me the bow of burning gold, bring me my arrows of desire, bring me my spear, O clouds unfold, bring me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land." I looked it up on Wikipedia, and there's this really interesting section analyzing the themes in this poem that do seem to connect it to the themes of this movie. The phrase, "dark satanic mills," which entered the English language from this poem, is often interpreted as referring to the early Industrial Revolution and its destruction of nature and human relationships. That view has been linked to the fate of the Albion flour mills in Southwark, the first major factory in London. The rotary steam-powered flour mill, built by Matthew Boulton, assisted by James Watt, could produce 6,000 bushels of flour per week. The factory could have driven independent traditional millers out of business, but it was destroyed in 1791 by fire. There were rumors of arson, but the most likely cause was a bearing that overheated due to poor maintenance. London's independent millers celebrated with placards reading, "Success to the mills of Albion, but no Albion mills." Opponents referred to the factory as satanic and accused its owners of adulterating flour and using cheap imports at the expense of British producers. A contemporary illustration of the fire shows a devil squatting on the building. The mill was a short distance from Blake's home. Blake's phrase resonates with a broader theme in his works, what he envisioned as a physically and spiritually repressive ideology based on a quantified reality. Blake saw the cotton mills and collieries of the period as a mechanism for the enslavement of millions. But the concepts underpinning the works had a wider application. Another interpretation is that the phrase refers to the established Church of England, which, in contrast to Blake, preached a doctrine of conformity to the established social order and class system. The phrase green and pleasant land has become a common term for an identifiably English landscape or society. It appears as a headline, title, or subtitle in numerous articles and books. Sometimes it refers, whether with appreciation, nostalgia, or critical analysis, to idyllic or enigmatic aspects of the English countryside. In fact, there's a book called A Green and Pagan Land, which is all about the influence of England's mythology and neo-pagan naturalist nostalgia on English film and television. I haven't read the book yet, but I'll make sure to read it after I'm finished making this video because it looks interesting. And from a brief scan that I did, it appears to cover a lot of the same points that I've covered in this video, including, of course, a lot of material about Penda's Fen and the Wicker Man. The part in this poem that really lights up Stephen's eyes is where the headmaster says, "And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills?" The divine countenance is the face of God. Blake is asking if God himself ever appeared on England's clouded hills. And that gets Stephen thinking, because he has pondered something similar at the beginning of the movie. It seems that Stephen often thought about Elgar walking the very same hills that rise outside his window, and hearing such divine music in his head. He also saw an angel rising over these hills in a dream. If there's anywhere where Stephen can go to meet with the divine countenance, it's going to be these hills. And so he takes this recitation from Blake as a prompt for him to leave Penvin for a while and walk in these hills. And that's where he meets the mother and father of England, whom he met earlier in the courtyard and whom he praised for their timely injunction against the Jesus documentary. They come again to speak to him properly for the first time, as one of their sons, a true son of light, pure and perfect, as if he were going to be the second coming of King Arthur.
Think of that torment, to be burned, shackled to the mockery of a tree and burned, living, burned away.
What torment is that? Through the flames, we see our Lord. He reaches out his hand to bring us from the shadow of this world. When we were burned, we cried in joy. The Crostons think we scream. We cried in joy. When we are burned, why we are turned to light.
Look. Your inheritance.
The kings of the earth you can govern. They walk in their sleep. Yours is the right to inherit the power, to will their will. Power, Stephen, to turn the rock of the world to wealth. Power, to fall and not to die. Like Joan the maid, to fall and not to die.
You have to come with us. You are our child of light. You have to be born in us. Then you become pure light.
So, let me try to explain this. The basic idea here is that they represent an ideal that Stephen subscribed to at the beginning of the movie, but has now come to be suspicious of, and even fearful of. This idea that England is a nation of children in need of guidance, that English liberty can only be protected by people who exercise eternal vigilance on its behalf, not by people who praise the abstraction of freedom itself in all of its manifestations. This vigilance comes in the form of censorship, thought control, and purity. If we let society get too permissive and too adventurous, we threaten to undermine the establishment that has granted us this exceptional privilege of liberty in the first place. We threaten to take our lives for granted. Stephen has always had the ambition of a patriot, the ambition of a man who does great things and provides a great service for his country. And at one point, this is what he considered his service to be. But after going through his transformation, he no longer feels comfortable imagining himself in this role, and that's because of this scene in the courtyard and how it connects to Joan the Maid. These two people relish the idea of Joan the Maid. They relish the idea of martyrdom, of self-sacrifice, of willingly offering up your hands to the bloody tree stump, which symbolizes not only the destruction of the young generation, but also the destruction of nature and the destruction of human nature. The tamed and manicured English garden that bottles up the primal genie of the earth and perverts him. These people love immolation because they believe fire is a purifying force, that fire can cleanse the soul of all of its impurities and return this refracted spectrum of light to the original source, pure white. To Stephen, this great big white world looks increasingly like a frightening dystopian outlook that we must destroy everything that makes us human in order to become godly, that we must rip apart our connection to nature in order to rise above our inner natures. At one point, Stephen wanted to be pure, but he realized that he doesn't have the capacity to be that person. So the question is, will Stephen accept martyrdom? Will Stephen accept the immolation of his true nature to be born in them as pure light?
No. No. Oh. I am nothing pure. Nothing pure. My race is mixed. My sex is mixed. I am woman and man. Light with darkness.
We can't have him, darkness must not.
It seems at this moment that there is still a conflict in Stephen's core over how he views impurity. He does seem a little bit ashamed of it, like he still wishes he could be pure, even though he knows he can't. But there's also an indecision in his voice, like he's hoping that he can learn to accept his impurities for what they are, but the mental conditioning he has undergone makes it difficult. But because he does not offer his hands on the proverbial bloody stump, the mother and father of England decide to burn him themselves, and as Stephen runs away, they snap a Polaroid of him and light it on fire, while the frightfully dissonant organ chord from the Dream of Gerontius plays in the background. Of course, this organ music definitely foreshadows the fact that in this moment Stephen is going to meet his Lord again, although it won't be Jesus this time. We could maybe say that in snapping a picture of Stephen, they are attempting to steal his soul and burn it. That's an interpretation I've heard from other people in the past, but I think a more fitting analogy is that they are burning him in effigy, much like how they nailed Jesus to the cross in effigy with these crucifixes. They're creating a false image of Stephen, which they can then use as a martyr for their own purposes. But just as the memory of Jesus is effectively crucified over and over in this way, Stephen is burned physically by this. In perverting and destroying Stephen's image, they do damage to Stephen and his legacy. In making a martyr out of the plaster Christ, they make a martyr out of the real Christ. In preventing the airing of the television documentary Who is Jesus, they are making an effort to stamp out and destroy any reality in the unholy, bastardized myth that they are preaching, to keep Jesus buried. In making a martyr out of Stephen's image, they burn, destroy, and bury his true message. And just as Joan of Arc called out to Jesus, Stephen, in this moment of immolation, calls out to his Lord. But as we have established, perhaps it wasn't Jesus to whom Joan was calling out. Perhaps it was one of her older village gods, Samson, Marduk, Balder. For Stephen, there is no one more appropriate than Penda. Penda appears to Stephen engulfed in flame, but unharmed. There might be some symbolic significance of this relating to martyrdom, but I'm not really sure what it is.
There you have seen your true dark enemies of England, sick father and mother, who would have us children forever. Stephen, our land must live. This land we love must live. Her deep dark flame must never die. Night is falling. Your land and mine goes down into a darkness now. And I and all the other guardians of her flame are driven from our home up out into the wolf's jaw. But the flame still flickers in the fen. You are marked down to cherish that. Cherish the flame till we can safely wake again. The flame is in your hands, we trust it you, our sacred demon of ungovernableness. Stephen, be secret, child, be strange, dark, true, impure, and dissonant. Cherish our flame, our dawn shall come.
This is a great speech because it ties the whole movie together perfectly. It immediately refocuses the Manichaean theme as Penda talks about the world as a battleground between light and dark, and light as a vulnerable spark in man that must be protected by guardian prophets like himself and Stephen. But here we see that light is not purity, and dark is not impurity. It is, in fact, the opposite. The light, the great sacred flame of England, is actually its demon of ungovernableness. It is precisely the union of opposites, the light and the dark, the impurity, the mixing of races, the mixing of sexes, the mixing of ideas and beliefs. It is this that lights the fire in mankind. It is this that makes life worth living. Penda also talks about the guardians of England's flame being driven from their homes and into the wolf's jaw. This not only refers to the spiritual repression of England, but also the destruction of England's natural environment, as human nature and nature are here intimately linked. Whatever the military is building out in the fen is destroying the natural countryside. They are threatening to destroy the fen, and with it, all of the ancient memory it possesses. So, it is up to Stephen to carry the flame with him wherever he goes, so that it never extinguishes, in hope that someday mankind will wake up and achieve that last rebellion and resurrection that Reverend Franklin hoped for. This scene is like the end of the Lorax, where the Onceler gives the truffulus seed to the kid.
Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not.
The dormant hope of resurrection is the note on which this movie and the Lorax end. And in a brilliant moment of visual metaphor, the last shot is Stephen walking back to the village, just as Reverend Franklin said. Revolt from the monolith. Come back to the village. So what was the deal with the hand at the beginning of the movie? It's not Brat's hand. It's not Penda's hand. Penda's hand is much older and covered in blood in imitation of Jesus rather than this weird molten lava stuff. There's never a part in the movie where Stephen is grasping at barbed wire, and when he's being burned, he's just rolling around in the grass, so it's not Stephen's hand. I guess the barbed wire is supposed to represent whatever the military is building out in the fen. This is the fence that they have cordoned off for their work. And thus it represents basically everything that this movie is against, you know, the whole fencing off of our values and beliefs. And perhaps whoever is grasping at this fence is trying to escape this barbaric destruction of the human spirit, symbolized by his burning flesh in a Y-shaped cruciform pattern, symbolic of this martyrdom, and burning the refracted light of human nature to return it into pure white. It's a visual metaphor for all of the themes in this movie combined into one. And it also brings to mind an event that actually happened to this movie with Brat the Sheepfucker. So it's really clever in that way, in that it's reminiscent of something that happened in the movie, and yet it's not actually an actual depiction of something that happened. It's more of a symbolic representation of the movie's themes as a whole. I hope that by now I convinced you that Penda's Fen is one of the greatest movies of all time, because I certainly think it is. I like how it presents subversive themes through an academic framing, and how it subverts English patriotism by, ironically, being even more patriotic and even more traditionalist, hearkening back to pre-Christian England for inspiration. It's very disarming in that way. The pace is leisurely, the tone is calming. It is pastoral, rural, and elegant. The movie doesn't do anything to shock or offend you, and yet its social commentary is even more potent because of that. It really seems rooted out of love rather than cynicism, and that's what makes it unique as social commentary. It isn't satirical, it isn't a takedown, it's a true and honest lament and a call for hope. In that way, it's remarkably different from something like Marilyn Manson or Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, which are both bitingly satirical and cynical in their own ways. But at the same time, the message of these three works is remarkably similar. And while I've already made many videos about Marilyn Manson, and will continue to do so in the future, the one I haven't touched yet is Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared. Not for a lack of trying, mind you, I've just found it the most difficult of the three subjects to approach. And I've tried and failed many, many times to make a video about it, but rest assured that at some point, I will make my Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared video, and thus round off this trifecta of brilliance. Maybe at some point I'll even do a triple analysis where I compare and contrast the three of them together, because I do think they are all great examples of subversive creativity. But as for Penda, I have said what I have to say for now. Until next time. Happy resurrecting.
That's all.
Joel,
Him all right, Dove. I killed him.
I'm all right.